town of Riverbend, the perfect Miller family vanished without a trace, leaving behind a life frozen in time. For 20 years, their story was a cold case buried in grief and mystery. The only person who never moved on was David's reclusive brother, Arthur Miller, the grieving heir who seemed paralyzed by loss. But when a forgotten clue surfaces, it unravels a secret Arthur fought to keep hidden. A secret that proves the most dangerous monster wasn't lurking in the shadows, but standing in plain sight. Playing the part of a heartbroken brother, the town of Riverbend, Ontario was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Nestled in a landscape of rolling hills and dense forests, it was a community where everyone knew each other's names, and a change in the weather was considered front-page news. On Cedar Street, the grand, century-old Victorian home of the Miller family stood as a symbol of this idyllic stability. Its wraparound porch was always swept. Its gardens were a burst of colorful, well-tended blooms in the spring, and in the winter, smoke curled cozily from its red brick chimney. To their neighbors, David and Sarah Miller were the very embodiment of the good life. David, a high school math teacher, was known for his endless patience and his ability to make even the most reluctant student understand complex equations. Sarah, whose oil paintings of the local landscapes were sold in a boutique downtown, was the warm, creative heart of their home. Their children, 10-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Sam, were well-mannered and bright, often seen riding their bikes in the quiet cul-de-sac or building snow forts in the front yard during the long Canadian winters. They were not just a family, they were an institution, the benchmark against which others in Riverbend measured their own happiness and success. The day they vanished, November 12, 2003, was utterly unremarkable. The morning had been frosty, giving way to a pale, sunny afternoon. Sarah had been seen at the grocery store, loading her cart with ingredients for a stew. David had stayed late at school for a parent-teacher conference. Lily and Sam had been dropped off by the school bus at 3:45 p.m., just like any other day. A neighbor waved to them as they trudged up the driveway, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. The last confirmed sighting of any of them was at approximately 6:30 p.m., when the flickering blue light of their television was visible through the living room window. The following morning, the paperboy noticed the previous day's paper was still on the step. By lunchtime, a concerned neighbor, noticing the unusual quiet and the fact Sarah had missed their weekly coffee meetup, knocked on the door. Receiving no answer, she called the police. The officers who arrived found a scene of profound and unsettling normality. The front door was locked. They entered through the back, which was also locked but with a key hidden under a flower pot, a practice common in Riverbend. Inside, the house was perfectly tidy. The dinner dishes had been washed and were drying on a rack beside the sink. In the living room, the family's board game of choice, a well-worn copy of Scrabble, was set up on the coffee table as if waiting for players to return. The children's beds were neatly made, their school clothes laid out for the next day. The family's winter coats, boots, and the single set of car keys were all gone. Their vehicle sat undisturbed in the driveway. There were no overturned furniture, no scuff marks on the floor, no signs of a break-in or a struggle. It was a complete and total vacuum of evidence. The Millers had not been taken from their home. They had, for all intents and purposes, simply walked out of it, leaving the comforting shell of their perfect life behind, silent and utterly empty. Investigation into the Miller family's disappearance began with a surge of energy and community solidarity. Police and volunteers combed through the nearby forests and fields, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The local news stations broadcast the family's photos, their smiling faces beaming out from television screens, a stark contrast to the grim reality. Tips flooded in from across the province, reported sightings in Toronto, a family matching their description at a gas station in Thunder Bay, a hiker who thought he heard children crying in a remote conservation area. Each lead was pursued with desperate hope, and each one dissolved into nothing, a dead end that only deepened the mystery. The case file grew thick with statements and theories, but it contained no answers. Within months, the frantic search slowed, then stalled. The story faded from the headlines, and the yellow police tape surrounding the house on Cedar Street was taken down. The case, once a top priority, was reluctantly moved to the cold cabinet, a silent monument to failure. In the wake of the tragedy, the figure of Arthur Miller, David's younger brother, emerged from the periphery. He was a man who seemed genetically designed to be overlooked. Where David was charismatic and outgoing, Arthur was quiet and withdrawn, a man who seemed to carry a permanent slouch, as if trying to physically diminish his presence. He worked as an accountant, a job that suited his precise, solitary nature. He had never married, had few friends, and lived in a small, sparsely furnished apartment on the other side of town. The community's gaze fell upon him with a mixture of pity and vague curiosity. He was the sole heir, the only remaining relative, the brother left behind. He became the unofficial keeper of the Miller legacy, the person the police would call once a year to ask if he'd heard anything, the point of contact for any stray tip that might trickle in. He attended the annual vigil held on the anniversary of their disappearance, standing at the back of the small crowd, his head bowed, his face a mask of quiet sorrow. He never offered theories or complained about the investigation's lack of progress. He simply accepted his role as the grieving guardian of a ghost story. He inherited the Victorian house on Cedar Street, but could not bring himself to step inside. He let the property stand exactly as it was, a perfectly preserved museum of a life interrupted. The lawn grew wild, the paint began to crack and peel, and the windows grew dark. To everyone in Riverbend, Arthur's inaction was a symptom of his profound grief. His refusal to move on or let go was seen as the ultimate testament to his love for his lost family. He was a sad figure, frozen in time, just like the house he couldn't bear to touch. This perception of Arthur as a man paralyzed by loss was the most effective disguise he could have ever chosen. It made him invisible, painting him not as a suspect, but as a fellow victim, ensuring that for nearly 2 decades, no one ever thought to look at him too closely. Miller's case file was a physical object, a heavy cardboard box filled with paper, photographs, and reports that had gathered dust in the Riverbend Police Service evidence room for nearly 2 decades. Its transition from this analog archive to a digital format was part of a provincial initiative to preserve old records, a bureaucratic process done without expectation. The contents were scanned page by page by a civilian technician who had no knowledge of the case, each document becoming a PDF saved to a server. It was this digital copy that landed in the virtual lap of Eli Sanderson, a third-year criminology student at the University of Ottawa. Eli had grown up hearing the local legend of the family that vanished and had chosen their story as the subject for a deep-dive episode of his fledgling True Crime podcast. He filed a formal access to information request expecting little and was granted a massive, disorganized digital folder containing thousands of images. The work was tedious. Evenings and weekends were spent hunched over his laptop, scrolling through blurry scans of handwritten officer notes, evidence logs, and lists of interviewed neighbors. He was looking for anything that might have been missed, any small detail that modern hindsight could reinterpret. The breakthrough came not with a dramatic evidence photo or a shocking witness statement, but with a single, typewritten line in a mundane evidence log dated November 13, 2003. It was a catalog of items collected from the Miller property's exterior. Listed between one green recycling bin, empty, and assorted garden waste, was an entry that made Eli stop and lean closer to his screen. Item Barrier 17, one plastic kitchen garbage bag, containing household refuse. Contents include food waste, packaging, and one receipt from Secure Store Self-Storage, dated November 12, 2003. His heart began to pound. The receipt was from the day they disappeared. He cross-referenced the log with the subsequent investigative reports. There was no follow-up interview with the storage facility, no mention of it in the detective's summary. The bag of trash, deemed irrelevant to a missing persons case, had been logged and almost certainly discarded. The lead had been buried not in a sinister way, but under the weight of assumption. In 2003, the police were looking for signs of a struggle or a hasty flight. A piece of trash in a bin was neither. It was a classic case of not knowing what you're looking for until you've already found it. Eli immediately understood its potential significance. A storage unit rented on the very afternoon the family vanished was not a coincidence. It was a thread frayed and faded by time, but a thread nonetheless. He compiled his findings into a concise email, attaching a highlighted screenshot of the evidence log, and sent it to the current Riverbend police chief, knowing he had just blown the dust off a case that had been closed for a generation. Discovery of the storage receipt sent a jolt through the Riverbend police service. forcing a reluctant reopening of the coldest case in its history. The first step was to locate the facility, which, to their astonishment, was not only still in business but had maintained impeccable digital records. A search under David Miller yielded an immediate hit. A 10 by 15-foot unit rented on November 12, 2003, at 4:18 p.m., paid for with a credit card in his name. The account had been set to auto-renew annually. For 18 years, the payment had cleared without issue. A silent, automated heartbeat in an otherwise cold case. The unit was still active. The current police chief, a young man who had been in grade school when the Millers vanished, understood the staggering implication. This was no longer a search for clues to a disappearance. It was a potential crime scene that had been preserved in time. They obtained a warrant, but as a formality, they contacted Arthur Miller, the legal heir and executor of David's estate, to inform him. He expressed quiet surprise over the phone, claiming he knew nothing about any storage unit but granting his full permission to open it. His voice a mask of cooperative confusion. The air inside the storage unit was ancient and still, thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things. When the officer cut the lock and rolled up the heavy door, the beam of his flashlight illuminated not the chaos of a hasty escape, but the ordered silence of a carefully planned departure. The space was packed with the Miller family's life, yet it was meticulously organized. Cardboard boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, each labeled in Sarah's elegant script: Lily's art, Sam's Legos, photo albums 1990-2000. There were shelves holding Sarah's most beloved paintings, carefully wrapped in cloth. David's university diplomas and teaching awards were laid flat in a portfolio case. They found the children's baby books, their first shoes cast in bronze, family videos on mini DV tapes, and boxes of financial documents and birth certificates. Every item was a treasure, a core memory, the foundational pieces of their identity. They had not packed in panic. They had curated their most precious possessions and hidden them away. This changed the entire narrative of their disappearance. They hadn't been running from a threat. They had been safeguarding their past before willingly stepping into a void. But the haunting question remained: why leave a trail? Why create this perfectly preserved time capsule and then ensure its bills were paid for 2 decades, creating a ticking time bomb of a clue that was guaranteed to be discovered eventually? It was a paradox that pointed away from the family and toward someone else, someone who had been paying to keep this secret hidden in plain sight. Revelation of the storage unit's contents created an unbearable tension. The police now knew the disappearance was a deliberate, calculated act. But the Millers' careful preservation of their treasures made no sense if they truly intended to vanish forever. The focus shifted from a missing persons case to a financial investigation. The annual payments for the unit were the only thread left to pull. Detectives subpoenaed the bank records for the credit card linked to the account. They expected to see a dead man's account kept active through some automated error. Instead, they discovered a devastating truth. The payments had not been coming from David's account at all. For 18 years, the annual fee had been deducted from a separate account owned solely by Arthur Miller. He had been quietly, consistently funding the preservation of the very evidence that could expose him. The grief-stricken brother was not a bystander. He was the architect. Confronted with this irrefutable paper trail, Arthur's carefully constructed persona crumbled. In a sterile interrogation room, he confessed not in a dramatic outburst, but in a flat, emotionless monotone. His motive was not the house or the money, but a deep, festering resentment that had curdled into hatred. He was obsessed with his brother's perfect life, a life he felt he deserved but was denied. The day they vanished, he had gone to the house to confront David. A violent argument ensued, escalating until Arthur, in a blind rage, attacked his brother and then Sarah when she tried to intervene. The children, witnesses to the horror, were his next victims. Panic set in. His accounting mind sought order in the chaos. He forced the terrified children to help him pack their most valued possessions, creating the illusion of a planned departure. He drove them to a remote corner of his hunting property, a place he knew would never be found. The storage unit was his solution to the problem of their cherished belongings. He couldn't bear to destroy them, yet he couldn't leave them in the house to be found. So he became its secret keeper, paying the bill year after year, performing the endless penance of the guilty. He attended the vigils not to mourn, but to monitor the investigation, to ensure his secret remained safe. His greatest performance was his portrayal of a man broken by grief. a role that granted him the ultimate cover of pity and ensured that for 20 years, the truth remained buried in the very ground he owned. The empty house on Cedar Street had finally given up its echo, and it was the sound of a brother's unimaginable betrayal